If you feel that money vanishes the moment it touches your hands, like fine sand slipping through tired fingers, listen closely. There is a silent law in the universe that punishes those who carry burdens that do not belong to them with endless poverty now. Kael was the strongest builder in the valley, a man who believed that the weight on his back was the only proof of his worthiness. He built bridges for everyone else to cross into prosperity, yet he remained on the muddy bank, cleaning the dirt from his boots. For years, he told himself that suffering was noble, unaware that his addiction to pain was the iron wall blocking his wealth. He looked at the rich merchants passing by and felt a bitter envy, not knowing they simply refused to carry bags that weren't theirs. Before we begin this tale of liberation, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you are watching from. If you are ready to put down the heavy stone you carry today, let us discover why your wallet remains empty while your heart is full of worries that were never yours to begin with, my friend. This is the story of how Kael learned that money is a guest that refuses to enter a house filled with the garbage of other people. Kael worked from dawn until the moon was high, his hands calloused like the rough stones he shaped, convinced that rest was a sin committed only by the lazy and weak. He carried a permanent tightness in his chest, a sensation of holding back an explosion, as if he had swallowed 1,000 screams that now lived inside his muscles. His workshop was a place of shadows and dust, not because he lacked skill, but because every gold coin he earned was immediately drained by a leak he refused to fix. That leak had a name, a face, and a sob story. It was his cousin Doran, a man who had turned the act of playing the victim into a highly profitable profession. Doran would appear at the workshop door just as Kael was counting his earnings, his face twisted into a mask of despair that he had practiced in the mirror for hours. He brought stories of violent creditors, sudden illnesses, and terrible luck, weaving a web of guilt that wrapped around Kael's throat and squeezed until he paid up. Doran knew exactly which buttons to push, using Kael's childhood promise to always protect family as a precise weapon against him. Kael would feel a heavy ball of anger in his stomach, but he would swallow it down, believing that being the good man meant sacrificing his own peace for family. He thought he was helping, but deep down, Kael was addicted to the feeling of being the strong one, the savior who could endure any amount of pain without breaking. One afternoon, a carriage arrived in the village carrying the royal architect, a man known for building palaces that seemed to float on air, defying gravity itself. The architect was looking for a master builder to execute a massive project, and he watched Kael work from a distance, observing not his skill, but his heavy spirit. He saw how Kael moved, bent forward as if carrying an invisible ox on his shoulders, his eyes darting to the door in fear of who might come to demand his energy. The architect approached Kael and offered him a pouch of gold as an advance, a sum so large it could have bought the entire workshop and the land it stood upon. Kael stared at the gold with a mix of terror and awe, his first thought not being what he could build, but how he would hide this from Doran's prying, hungry eyes. As if summoned by the scent of opportunity, Doran burst into the shop moments later, claiming he owed money to bandits who would take his life if he did not pay. Kael felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the automatic impulse to open his hand and give everything away just to stop the noise and relieve the tension he felt. He reached for the pouch of gold, his hand trembling with the effort of the sacrifice, telling himself that this was the righteous thing to do for his own blood. The architect stepped forward, his cane striking the floor with a sound like a thunderclap, freezing the transaction and silencing Doran's pathetic, fake weeping. He looked Kael in the eye and spoke with a voice that cut through the emotional fog. "You are not saving him, builder. You are paying him to remain a useless cripple." The architect continued, "Money is an energy that requires space to flow. And your life is so full of another man's problems that there is no room for wealth." Doran tried to protest, but the architect laughed coldly, revealing that he had seen Doran gambling at the tavern just an hour before, laughing about his gullible cousin. The revelation hit Kael like a physical blow to the gut. The pain he had carried, the virtue of his suffering, was all a lie he told himself to feel important. He realized that by cushioning Doran's falls, he had robbed his cousin of the dignity of facing consequences, making Doran weaker and himself poorer with every coin. The architect whispered the final truth. "You stay poor because you are arrogant enough to think you can carry the fate of another adult. Drop the weight, Kael." Kael looked at his cousin and saw not a victim, but a predator who fed on his need to be the good guy. And for the first time, the anger in his stomach exploded. He did not shout, but his voice was deeper than the mountain roots. Get out, Doran, and never come back until you have earned the bread you eat with your own hands. Doran screamed, called him selfish, and threatened to destroy his reputation, but Kael stood tall, the invisible ox finally gone from his shoulders, breathing freely. With Doran gone, the silence in the workshop was not empty but pregnant with possibility. Kael used the gold not to pay debts, but to buy the finest marble available. He renovated his workspace, turning the dusty shed into a hall of light and stone, and bought clothes that reflected the master craftsman he had always been inside. The villagers were shocked to see Kael walking with his head high, wearing velvet instead of rags, no longer apologizing for his existence or hiding his success. Money began to flow into his life like a river that had finally found its course, staying in his pockets because he no longer felt the subconscious need to expel it. He understood that prosperity flees from those who enjoy the identity of the sufferer, for wealth demands a host who believes they are worthy of joy, not pain. As for Doran, forced to face the world without Kael's shield, he tried his usual tricks on a merchant from the south, who did not suffer from Kael's savior complex. The merchant had Doran arrested for fraud, and in the cold cell of the local jail, Doran finally learned the lesson that Kael's money had prevented him from learning. Months later, Kael sat on the terrace of his new home, sipping wine that tasted of freedom, watching the sun set over the bridge he had built for himself this time. The architect returned to inspect the work and nodded in approval, not just at the building but at the man who had rebuilt the ruined structure of his own soul. Kael realized that the greatest charity he could offer the world was not to carry its burdens, but to stand as a shining example of what happens when you claim your power. He had stopped being a warehouse for other people's tragedies and became a temple for his own abundance, proving that you cannot help the poor by becoming one of them. The pain in his back was gone. Replaced by the strength of a man who knows his boundaries are the walls that protect his kingdom, his peace, and his treasury. Money had stopped running from him because he had stopped running from himself, and in that stillness he found the fortune that had been waiting for him to wake up. Tell us where you are watching from and comment, I am ready to receive, if you are done carrying bags that aren't yours. And share this with someone who needs to drop a heavy load today to finally be free.